Let's open up a true historical detective story. Today, we're investigating one of the most enigmatic, fascinating figures in all of ancient literature, Melchizedek. We're going to use the historical record, canonical texts, and the rich history of interpretation to uncover how a fleeting, almost random-seeming encounter in the ancient Near East fundamentally reshaped ancient theology. Okay, let's dive into this, because it is incredibly rare to find a historical figure who occupies so little real estate in a primary text, yet leaves such a towering legacy. Seriously, how does a man mentioned in exactly 4 verses in the entire Hebrew Bible become a central pillar of Second Temple eschatology and a cornerstone of New Covenant theology? The sheer improbability of that text-to-legacy ratio is exactly what makes this investigation so compelling. So, here is our detective's roadmap for this explainer. First, the ultimate biblical mystery. Second, the historical encounter. Third, the royal priestly oath. Fourth, Second Temple interpretations. And finally, the typological blueprint. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the ultimate biblical mystery. To really grasp the historical anomaly we're dealing with, you just have to look at the number 4. That is the total number of verses dedicated to Melchizedek in the Hebrew Bible. He pops up briefly in Genesis chapter 14 and then completely vanishes for a millennium until he gets a single shout-out in Psalm 110. Yet despite that incredibly tiny footprint, his historical and theological impact is just massive. Moving to Section 2, the historical encounter. To crack this case, we have to look closely at the ancient Near East. The text introduces Melchizedek as the king of Salem. Now that comes from the root word for peace, but historically it's recognized as early ancient Jerusalem. It also calls him a priest of El Elyon, which translates to God Most High. What is staggering here historically is that we are looking at a Canaanite priest king operating outside of any established Israelite framework. Melchizedek was a non-Israelite serving the true creator God right there in early Jerusalem, way before the Mosaic covenant or the Levitical priesthood were even a thought. So let's walk through the actual chronological sequence of this ancient meeting. Abram has just won a major regional battle against a coalition of northern kings. He's on his way back, and Melchizedek comes out to meet him, bringing bread and wine. Now, historically speaking, this was not an animal sacrifice or some deep cultic ritual. In the socio-political reality of the ancient Near East, bringing bread and wine was the ultimate symbol of royal hospitality for an exhausted army. Melchizedek then pronounces a formal blessing over Abram, and in response, Abram gives him a tenth of all the spoils of war. Now pay close attention to what the text actually leaves out. In the ancient Near East, genealogy was literally everything. If you were a priest, your lineage, your documented birth, your eventual death, those were your credentials. Your ancestral resume gave you legal authority. Yet the biblical narrator gives Melchizedek no father, no mother, and no genealogy. This sound of silence is a highly intentional narrative strategy. It's not a mistake. It sets him apart as an earthly priest king, defined purely by divine appointment, rather than who his parents were. So the crucial point is the hierarchy established in this exact historical moment. When Abram, the great patriarch, the guy who holds the divine promises, accepts the blessing and voluntarily hands over a tenth of his hard-won spoils, he is visibly acknowledging Melchizedek's superior priestly standing. This proves that a legitimate, exalted priesthood existed way before and entirely outside of the genealogical boundaries of Sinai. Let's look at Section 3, the royal priestly oath. Fast forward almost 1,000 years. You see, this wasn't just an isolated weird incident in the patriarchal era. It's an evolving promise plan that develops organically across time. It kicks off in Genesis 14, resurfaces in the Davidic era, gets heavily debated during the Second Temple period, and reaches its climax in the New Covenant era. The historical plan wasn't making sudden left turns. It was maturing. When David established ancient Salem, Jerusalem, as his capital, he historically inherited its ancient royal traditions. And in Psalm 110, we see a prophetic bridge built right to the future. God swears an unbreakable divine oath. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Remember, Levitical priests were appointed by statute and strictly kept away from the throne. But this oath, it permanently locks kingship and priesthood together in one single Davidic figure. Which brings us to Section 4, Second Temple interpretations. Now, what's really interesting about this is that this incredible oath left later thinkers with a massive historical puzzle. The original Genesis narrative intentionally left out his backstory, right? And that created a wide-open textual space. different groups essentially rushed in to fill that narrative silence in ways that fit their own specific worldviews. Just to give you an idea of how wide this gets, the community at Qumran viewed Melchizedek as a celestial judge and heavenly deliverer. Over in Alexandria, the philosopher Philo allegorized him as a symbol of the righteous mind. The historian Josephus took a much more grounded approach, treating him simply as a historical Canaanite king who built the first temple in Jerusalem. And meanwhile, later rabbinic traditions actually identified him with Noah's son Shem. They essentially gave him a historical retcon to ensure his priesthood remained safely within Israel's known ancestral family tree. It's just a fascinating look at how ancient historical text meets human interpretation. And finally, Section 5, the typological blueprint. So this brings us to how the author of Hebrews utilized this rich history to explain a completely new era. The author uses a very ancient concept known as corporate solidarity to prove Melchizedek's superiority. The argument is kind of brilliant. Under Mosaic law, the Levites collected tithes, but when Abraham paid a tithe to Melchizedek way back in Genesis 14, the unborn generations of Israel, including Levi and his future priesthood, were essentially present within their ancestor. Therefore, the Levitical priesthood functionally submitted to the Melchizedekian order before they were literally even born. Let's de-jargon the concept of typology for a second. Typology is basically just a historical blueprint. On one side of the blueprint, we have the Aaronic Levitical order. It relies on physical descent, mortal succession, and repeated animal offerings, with kingship and priesthood kept strictly apart. On the other side is the Melchizedekian blueprint. It relies on a divine oath, an indestructible life, a once-for-all offering, and it elegantly combines kingship and priesthood in a single person. And this brilliantly illustrates that the transition wasn't about God angrily erasing the old law. Not at all. It was a targeted, necessary reordering. Because the ultimate high priest conquered death, his priesthood is based on an indestructible life, meaning he doesn't need biological successors. The Levitical era at Sinai was not a failed experiment. Think of it more like vital, temporary pedagogical scaffolding, a teaching tool designed for a very specific season. It fits perfectly into this broader, organic sequence that stretches all the way from Eden's cosmic temple, through the patriarchs, straight to the new covenant. Each stage keeps, enriches, and builds upon that same original promise. This leads us right into a critical concept: non-supersessionism. Now, that is a big academic word, but what it means is incredibly beautiful. It means that when Gentile believers are brought into this promise, grafted in, kind of like wild branches into a cultivated olive tree, they do not cancel, replace, or supersede the original natural branches. Ethnic Israel's historical gifts and calling remain entirely irrevocable. This unified Melchizedekian priesthood accommodates both Jew and Gentile without erasing their historical distinctions. Well, we've traced an incredible historical detective story today, haven't we? Going from a dusty, ancient meeting outside early Jerusalem all the way to a cosmic blueprint for human restoration. So here's the thought I want to leave you with. In the creation account, humanity was given a royal and priestly vocation that was later fractured. If the ultimate unfolding historical plan was always to reunite those royal and priestly vocations to bring blessing to all nations, how does this ancient blueprint reshape your own sense of purpose and your own vocation today? Keep investigating, keep learning, and I'll see you in our next explainer.